really end that well, quite frankly, because he is totally opposed to Smithman being Jerry McCann and thinks it's a meaningless sighting. And I think Smithman is the key and still do. So we had this little tussle between us, and I kind of said, hey, let's just cool it. And that was that. And so after we reconnected, we had some lovely chats and sent some pictures back and forth of dogs. And he sent me his book because then maybe Madeleine would have fallen behind the couch. Maybe they would have been there to see that she had a problem or stop an abductor. But the only day they were a complete family of 5 was on May 2nd. They became an incomplete family of 5 on May 3rd. So that statement, our last completely happy day as a family of 5 was on May 2nd, is perfectly reasonable and is not proof that she died.
A little girl vanished from a holiday apartment in Praia da Luz, Portugal, and the world was shaken. But what if everything we have heard is wrong? In The Sudden Impulse, author Bernd Stellender insists Madeleine died on May 2, not May 3. Profiler Pat Brown pushes back hard and says this is the moment to re-examine every detail, every puzzle piece, and the fatal contradictions. Which version is true, and why does the case remain unsolved after all these years? When Bernd Stellender entered the crowded and contentious landscape of Madeleine McCann theories, he did not arrive quietly. His name first began to circulate in true crime forums, not through a measured research paper or a sober TV interview, but through what he later admitted was a publicity stunt. Dressed head to toe in black, wearing a mask emblazoned with the word True H, Stellender stood on a cliff and posed for the cameras. To some, the image was theatrical and absurd. To others, it symbolized his determination to expose what he believed had been buried for more than a decade. Whether one considered it a gimmick or a bold act, it ensured that when his book The Sudden Impulse appeared, it did so under a spotlight. Stellender is not a police detective or a forensic scientist. He does not come from the official investigative ranks of Portugal's Policia Judiciaria or Britain's Operation Grange. Yet he positioned himself as a careful reader of documents, a man who had examined witness statements, timelines, and linguistic details with a dogged persistence. He promised that his book would offer a solution to the riddle that had consumed the world since May 2007. And that solution was not just a variation on familiar speculation. It was, in his view, a revelation that rewrote the entire chronology. At the heart of Stellender's theory lies one striking claim: Madeleine did not die on the night of May 3, as most reconstructions assume, but the night before, May 2. According to him, everything that followed the criache check-ins, the casual conversations, the tapas dinners was an elaborate theater performance. The McCanns and their friends, he suggested, staged an entire day in order to protect themselves. By shifting the date of Madeleine's death back by 24 hours, Stellender believed he could collapse the scaffolding on which both the abduction narrative and the Portuguese accidental death theory had been built. The title of his book, The Sudden Impulse, captures what he views as the decisive moment in this alternative story. In his telling, the McCanns found themselves in a crisis late on May 2. Madeleine was dead. Instead of calling the authorities or confessing an accident, they experienced a sudden impulse to act, an instinctive decision to conceal the body before the night was over. According to Stellender, Jerry McCann, or perhaps one of the tapas group, carried Madeleine's body under the cover of darkness to a nearby cemetery. There, in a hurried and panicked move, they placed her in an above-ground tomb, a temporary hiding place that allowed them to regroup. The following day, May 3, became not the day of tragedy but the day of performance. From morning criache routines to evening tapas checks, every gesture was part of a carefully coordinated play designed to present Madeleine as alive, until the moment she was theatrically discovered missing. This concept of a sudden impulse is not entirely unique in criminal profiling. Investigators often distinguish between crimes that are premeditated and those that erupt in a moment of panic. What made Stellender's version provocative was that he redefined the impulse not as the act of violence itself, but as the decision to stage an alternate reality. For him, the impulse was not to harm but to deceive. It was the point at which the McCanns supposedly crossed a psychological boundary, choosing cover-up over disclosure. To bolster his case, Stellander leaned on techniques of statement analysis, particularly the ideas of embedded confession and leakage. In this method, investigators scrutinize the exact words people use, on the premise that hidden truths sometimes slip into their speech. Stellander highlighted one passage from Kate McCann's memoir, Madeleine, that has often been debated. On page 59 she writes, May 2, 2007, our last completely happy day, our last to date as a family of 5. To Stellander, this was not simply a poetic lament. He argued it was an embedded confession, a tacit admission that Madeleine never saw May 3. If the last fully happy day was May 2, then, by implication, something irreversible had already occurred. He interpreted this as leakage, a subconscious slip of truth. Critics like Pat Brown later countered that such readings are plagued by confirmation bias. That last happy day could just as easily describe the final day before disaster struck on the evening of May 3. But Stellander's interpretation illustrates his broader strategy. Rather than focusing solely on forensic results, he sought meaning in the psychological traces left behind in words, in what he believed were cracks in the official story. Stellander also argued that moving the date of death to May 2 had profound legal implications. For years, prosecutors in Germany had attempted to build a case against Christian Bruckner, a convicted offender who was living in the Algarve at the time. Bruckner was publicly declared a suspect in 2020, with investigators claiming phone records placed him near Praia da Luz on May 3. If Madeleine had died on May 2, Stellander reasoned, Bruckner's candidacy as an abductor collapsed. He could not be linked to a death that, in Stellander's theory, had already occurred a day earlier and had nothing to do with strangers lurking outside apartment 5A. In his interviews, Stellander described his book as a game changer. By that he meant not merely another speculative angle, but a theory that destroyed the framework of both the abduction scenario and the prevailing accident on May 3 narrative. In his view, once May 2 was accepted as the date of death, the dominoes fell, the tapas alibis became suspect, the nanny's notes could be read as complicit, the Smith sighting became irrelevant, and the Bruckner hypothesis dissolved. He positioned his argument as the missing piece that explained why so many investigative avenues had reached dead ends. If the police had been looking at the wrong day all along, every subsequent analysis was doomed to confusion. The game-changer language also reflected Stellander's confidence that his reconstruction could ignite a new phase of public and legal debate. He saw his theory not as a marginal curiosity, but as the correction that could finally unravel the case. In his promotion, he leaned into this confidence, telling interviewers that prosecutors would have to abandon the Bruckner pursuit once they grasped the implications. He even suggested that his book could force the McCann narrative to collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. Of course, such bold claims also attracted fierce pushback. Pat Brown, a seasoned profiler with television credentials, dismissed the May 2 theory as unrealistic, pointing out that any plan requiring a full day of coordinated deception, including the cooperation of an 18-year-old nanny, was fatally implausible. She argued that genuine sudden impulses happen in minutes, not after hours of group discussion. Yet even in rejection, Brown acknowledged the provocative force of Stellander's argument. By daring to relocate the timeline, he compelled readers to reconsider assumptions and reevaluate familiar evidence. For supporters, the sudden impulse demonstrated the value of outsider, persistence, a man outside official structures poring over overlooked details and daring to shout against consensus. For detractors, it embodied the dangers of overinterpretation, confirmation bias, and the seduction of narrative neatness. But no one could deny that Stellander's book kept the debate alive, sparking renewed discussions in forums, YouTube analyses, and podcasts. The stunt on the cliff, the mask with TRH, the insistence on a new timeline, each element fed into the sense that this was not just another theory, but an attempt to seize the narrative reins of one of the world's most famous, unsolved cases. Whether the sudden impulse truly changed the game remains contested. What it undeniably did was reignite public fascination with the smallest details, the wording of Kate's memoir, the shadows of the cemetery, the idea that a single day's shift could unravel 17 years of speculation. In the crowded arena of Madeleine McCann theories, Stellander's voice carved out a place not by consensus, but by confrontation. His book forced others to articulate why they believed what they believed, and in doing so, it ensured that the debate over May 2 versus May 3 would continue long after the headlines faded. When profiler Pat Brown finally received her copy of The Sudden Impulse, she approached it with an open but skeptical mind. She had spent years analyzing the Madeleine McCann case, publishing her own profile and speaking across multiple platforms. To her, the disappearance was not an academic puzzle, but a tragedy that revealed how people act under extreme stress. Stellander's book, with its bold claim that Madeleine died on May 2, promised to shake the case. But as Brown read through page after page, her skepticism hardened into firm opposition. By the time she spoke publicly about the book, she was clear and uncompromising Stellander was wrong. The critical events had not occurred on May 2. They had taken place on the evening of May 3. Brown's rejection of the May 2 theory centered on what she considered a basic misunderstanding of human psychology in crisis. If Madeleine had died on May 2, the McCanns would have discovered her late that night. They would have had the entire night to think, to plan, to rationalize. In such a scenario, there was no sudden impulse at all. What Stellander described as a moment of panic-driven concealment was, in Brown's words, nothing more than calculated planning. A sudden impulse, she explained, happens in the narrow corridor of panic, when a person has minutes to decide what to do. It does not happen after hours of deliberation. It does not happen after you have called in your friends, drafted a narrative, and plotted an entire day of theater. For Brown, the real sudden impulse occurred on May 3, during Jerry McCann's scheduled check of the children. She imagined him stepping into apartment 5A around 9 p.m., expecting to see 3 peacefully sleeping children. Instead, he found something entirely different: Madeleine dead or unresponsive behind the sofa. In that instant, he would have been hit with shock, fear, and the knowledge that every second counted. If he left her there, the cadaverine odor would begin to develop. If Kate returned to find the body, the catastrophe could not be concealed. It was precisely in that claustrophobic, panicked moment, Brown argued, that a sudden impulse was born. This was not the calculated, hours-long plotting Stellander described. It was the lightning bolt of fear that drives someone to act before thinking. In Brown's reconstruction, Jerry scooped up Madeleine and carried her out of the apartment. Where to hide her body became a problem for later. In the immediate moment, the goal was only to remove the evidence from the flat. Brown suggested that this was when the Smith family may have seen a man carrying a child toward the beach. That sighting, she maintained, remained one of the most important pieces of the puzzle. Brown's emphasis on psychological realism distinguished her from Stellander. She believed Stellander had allowed confirmation bias to dictate his theory, bending every fact to fit May 2. He relied too heavily on embedded confessions and leakage, interpreting Kate's words in her memoir as literal admissions rather than grief-stricken reflections. In contrast, Brown drew from decades of profiling experience, stressing that the behaviors people exhibit in moments of crisis are often clumsy, rushed, and improvisational. You don't spend 24 hours weaving an elaborate play, she essentially argued. You grab at the simplest, fastest solution because you are desperate to survive. Central to Brown's rebuttal was her dismantling of the idea that the entire Tapas group and a teenage nanny could have been co-opted into a day-long deception. Stellander's theory required that Kat, the 18-year-old Krejci worker, knowingly participate in a cover-up of a child's death. According to Stellander, she would have had to falsify sign-in sheets, tell investigators that Madeleine attended the Krejci on May 3, and maintain the lie under police questioning. Brown found this premise preposterous. She painted a vivid picture: imagine being a teenage employee, barely acquainted with the McCanns. Suddenly they confide that their daughter is dead and ask you to help them lie to the police. Would any rational teenager agree? Brown thought not. She believed Kat would have been horrified, panicked, and likely incapable of lying convincingly even if she had tried. Depending on an 18-year-old stranger to secure your freedom from prosecution, Brown argued, was not just improbable, it was ridiculous. No intelligent parent, let alone trained medical professionals like the McCanns, would gamble their lives on the cooperation of a teenage nanny. The implausibility did not end there. Stellander's reconstruction demanded that all 7 friends in the tapas group participate in the deception. According to his book, they staged their dinner conversations, their checks, their smiles, and their alibis, all while knowing Madeleine was already dead. Brown considered this scenario unwieldy to the point of absurdity. The more people involved, the greater the risk of exposure. Secrets of this magnitude are not preserved by expanding the circle of knowledge. They are preserved by keeping it as small as possible. In Brown's profile, perhaps 1 or 2 friends suspected something. But the idea of a theatrical troupe of 8 adults and a teenager playing out a day-long charade was the stuff of fiction, not real human behavior. Instead of scattering suspicion across a wide cast, Brown concentrated on what she saw as the critical piece of evidence: the Smith sighting. On the night of May 3, around 9:55 p.m., Martin Smith and his family observed a man carrying a little girl toward the beach. They remembered her light-colored pajamas, her dangling feet, and the man's awkward hold. Later, when Martin Smith saw Jerry McCann on television carrying one of his children off an airplane, he felt a jolt of recognition. The posture, the gait, the way the child rested against his body, Smith thought it matched. For Brown, this was not definitive proof that Jerry was the man they saw, but it was an invaluable clue. What mattered most was the McCanns' refusal to embrace the Smith sighting as potentially vital. Instead, they focused relentlessly on Jane Tanner's sighting, the so-called Tannerman, even after Scotland Yard's Crime Watch program suggested that Tannerman was likely just a vacationing doctor carrying his own child. If the Smith sighting had been harmless, Brown argued, the McCanns should have welcomed every effort to identify the man. Their avoidance suggested the opposite, that the Smith sighting threatened the narrative they were determined to protect. This was why Brown considered the Smithman the true key to the case. Not because the Smiths were flawless witnesses like all witnesses. Their recollections varied and contained uncertainties, but because the McCanns treated the sighting as something to be buried rather than pursued. In investigative profiling, what people try to suppress often speaks louder than what they highlight. Brown interpreted the absence of attention to Smithman as a glaring signal. By the time she finished her rebuttal, Brown had constructed a counter-theory rooted in what she believed to be common sense. May 2 required too much orchestration, too many participants, too much time. May 3, by contrast, fit the psychological profile of crisis-driven decision-making. Jerry returns, finds Madeleine unresponsive, panics and acts without thinking. He removes the body to delay discovery. Later that night, as Kate raises the alarm, a narrative of abduction is born. The subsequent inconsistencies in statements, the open window, the shifting details of checks, the dubious alibis are not signs of a 24-hour performance, but of hurried improvisation under mounting pressure. Brown's rejection of Stellander's theory did not mean she possessed all the answers. She acknowledged that many details remained uncertain: where Madeleine's body was hidden, how exactly the McCanns coordinated their stories, who among the tapas group knew what. But she insisted that focusing on May 3 was the only approach consistent with both psychology and evidence. In her words, Stellander's May 2 theory was a house of cards, impressive at first glance, but destined to collapse under scrutiny. In the wider debate, Brown's rebuttal served a crucial role. Stellander had thrown down a challenge, inviting readers to rethink assumptions. Brown responded by grounding the discussion in behavioral logic. The contrast between them revealed the ongoing tension in the McCann case, between elaborate reconstructions and the raw, messy reality of human behavior under stress. For Brown, the lesson was simple. People in crisis do not become playwrights. They do not draft scripts for others to follow across an entire day. They react in the moment, reaching for the nearest lifeline, however clumsy. To her, the true sudden impulse was not on May 2, but on May 3, in the dimly lit apartment where a father faced a nightmare and chose, in panic, to conceal rather than confess. Among the many contested threads in the Madeleine McCann case, few have sparked more debate than the dueling sightings known as Tannerman and Smithman. These two shadowy figures, each described by witnesses as carrying a young girl, stand at the crossroads of theory and controversy. One sighting has been spotlighted by the McCanns and their campaign, repeated in media appeals and splashed across official websites. The other has been downplayed, dismissed, or ignored, even though it may represent the most critical lead of all. To understand why, we need to revisit that spring night in Praia da Luz and trace the timeline between 9:15 and 10 p.m., a window of 45 minutes that could hold the key to everything. The first account came from Jane Tanner, one of the Tapas 7, who left the group's dinner table around 9:15 p.m. to check on her children. As she walked along the narrow street outside apartment 50A, she later claimed to have seen a man striding across the road carrying a small child. The girl, she said, wore light-colored pajamas consistent with Madeleine's. The man's clothing was dark, and his features were indistinct, but the image left an impression. This figure quickly became known as Tannerman. For the early investigators, this sighting seemed like gold, a potential abductor, captured in the very act of spiriting Madeleine away. At almost the exact same moment, however, another detail complicated the picture. Jerry McCann was outside the apartment speaking with a fellow vacationer, Jez Wilkins, just meters from where Tanner claimed to have passed. Wilkins later testified that he saw Tanner walk by, yet he noticed nothing unusual: no man, no child, no abduction unfolding before his eyes. The contradiction raised immediate doubts about Tanner's reliability. How could she witness something so striking, while the two men only a few feet away saw nothing at all? Nevertheless, the Tannerman image was lodged firmly in the narrative, reproduced in sketches and appeals. Fast forward 40 minutes. Around 9:55 to 10 p.m., another family walked through the winding streets of Praia da Luz. The Smiths, visiting from Ireland, had finished dinner and were returning to their apartment when they encountered a man carrying a little girl in his arms. They noticed her dangling feet, her pale sleepwear, and the way her head rested against the man's shoulder. This encounter occurred near the road leading down to the beach, just a few minutes' walk from the McCanns' holiday flat. Unlike Tanner, who saw a fleeting silhouette from a distance, the Smiths reported a closer and more substantial view. They described the girl as being around 3 to 4 years old, the same age as Madeleine. At first, the Smiths offered no identification beyond the description, but months later, Martin Smith saw footage of Jerry McCann on television, disembarking from an airplane with one of his children in his arms. The way Jerry carried his son, the posture, the angle of his head, the swing of his arms, it all triggered Martin's memory. He felt strongly that the man he had seen on the night of May 3 moved in the same way. To be clear, Smith never claimed absolute certainty. Witness identifications are notoriously fallible, but his sense of recognition added a new layer of controversy. From a profiler's perspective, this detail mattered less for its evidentiary weight than for its treatment by the McCann campaign. If you are the parent of a missing child, and a family reports seeing a man carrying a girl toward the ocean within the exact window of disappearance, you would expect to pursue that lead with relentless intensity. You would want the sighting publicized, sketches circulated, and appeals made for the man to come forward. Yet the McCanns did the opposite. On their official website, they continued to highlight the Tannerman sighting, even after Scotland Yard's later review suggested that Tannerman was not an abductor at all, but simply Dr. Totman, another vacationer carrying his daughter home from the Cray. This re-identification should have freed the McCanns to redirect attention to the Smith sighting. Instead, they minimized or ignored it. For Pat Brown, this silence spoke volumes. In her view, innocent parents would have demanded answers. Who was the man the Smiths saw? Could he have been the abductor? Why did he not come forward? The absence of such urgency suggested to Brown that the McCanns knew exactly why the Smith sighting was dangerous. It threatened the carefully constructed alibi Jerry claimed to have at 10 p.m., chatting at the tapas bar. If witnesses placed him instead on the street carrying a child toward the beach, the entire abduction story unraveled. The timeline underscores the importance of this debate. Jerry checked on the children around 9:05. At 9:15, Tanner saw her alleged Tannerman. At 9:30, Matt Oldfield claimed to peek into the apartment but did not actually see Madeleine. Between 9:15 and 10 lies a yawning 45-minute gap, during which almost anything could have happened. Madeleine could have died in an accident, Jerry could have discovered her body, and in a moment of panic, he could have decided to move her. The Smiths then emerge at 9:55, spotting a man carrying a girl of exactly the right age. To Brown, the puzzle pieces fit too neatly to be coincidence. The British media, however, leaned heavily into the Tannerman narrative. The idea of a mysterious abductor captured in a mother's friend's fleeting glance was dramatic and digestible. It aligned with the McCanns' consistent insistence that Madeleine had been snatched by a predator. The Smith sighting, by contrast, was ambiguous and potentially incriminating to the parents themselves. As a result, it was starved of oxygen in press conferences and official campaigns. When Scotland Yard staged its Crime Watch appeal in 2013, it presented the Tannerman sketch as if it still mattered, even though they now believed the man to be an innocent tourist. They offered the public Totman in place of Tannerman, but they did not shift focus to Smithman. For critics like Brown, this was a deliberate misdirection. Brown's analysis draws a sharp contrast between the two sightings. Tannerman was always weak, dependent on a single witness who may have misperceived in dim light. Smithman, on the other hand, was observed by multiple family members in close quarters, with details that matched Madeleine's clothing. More importantly, Smithman was seen at a time and place that perfectly intersected with the opportunity for concealment. The refusal of the McCanns and the authorities to champion this lead became, in Brown's profile, evidence in itself. What people avoid, she often says, tells you more than what they embrace. In the broader debate, the clash between Smithman and Tannerman highlights the tension between two narratives. One is the abduction story, sustained for years by media campaigns and official rhetoric. The other is the possibility of a cover-up, where the most damning sighting is the one least discussed. Whether Martin Smith's recognition of Jerry's gait was accurate or not, the behavior surrounding the sighting raises critical questions. Why would the McCanns, desperate to find their daughter, sideline a credible witness account? Why invest so heavily in a weaker, now debunked sighting? And why does the official timeline continue to rest on assumptions that leave a 45-minute black hole unexamined? For Pat Brown, the answers converge on one conclusion: the Smith sighting is the true key. Not because it offers an airtight identification, but because its suppression reveals the pressure points of the case. If the McCanns were truly innocent, Smithman should have been their greatest hope. Instead, it became their greatest threat, and in the murky space between 9:15 and 10 p.m., in the silence between shifting statements and changing alibis, Brown believes the truth of Madeleine's fate still waits to be uncovered. Every notorious case develops its own mythology. Those handful of clues that dominate headlines, divide experts, and leave the public endlessly debating their meaning. In the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, 5 such clues have taken center stage. They are the open window and shutter in apartment 5A, the unlocked front door, Jane Tanner's sighting of a supposed abductor, the Smith family's later sighting of a man with a child, and the alerts from cadaver dogs combined with disputed DNA traces. Each clue has been cited as both proof of abduction and as evidence of staging, and each, when scrutinized, raises more questions than it answers. On the night of May 3, 2007, Kate McCann reported finding the bedroom window open, the curtain billowing, and the shutter raised. It seemed to her the telltale sign of an intruder who had entered the apartment and stolen her daughter. This became the foundation of the abduction narrative. Yet when investigators from the Polizia Judiciaria examined the scene, they found no signs of forced entry. The dust and grime on the windowsill appeared undisturbed. There were no smudges consistent with someone climbing in. And neighbors reported that the heavy shutter was notoriously difficult to raise from the outside. The absence of physical corroboration cast immediate doubt. Was the window opened by a kidnapper, or by someone inside attempting to create the appearance of one? For critics, the open window symbolized staging. Why, they asked, would a careful predator choose the noisy, risky task of climbing in and out of a narrow window when the sliding patio doors were easier and often left unlocked? Supporters of the abduction theory countered that intruders sometimes act irrationally or opportunistically. But the lack of evidence at the window continues to haunt the case. It is a clue that appears significant, but may ultimately be a theatrical flourish. Equally controversial was the family's routine of leaving the front door unlocked. The McCanns admitted they often did this while dining at the tapas restaurant, only about 70 meters away. Their rationale was convenience. They wanted each parent and their friends to be able to check on the children without fumbling for keys. But this practice, while understandable on holiday, introduced serious vulnerabilities. If Madeleine was abducted, critics argued, the simplest method was not through a shuttered window, but through that very door, wide open to anyone willing to take a chance. The unlocked door functions as a Rorschach test of sorts. To those who believe in abduction, it is the obvious entry point. To skeptics, it is an example of parental negligence later reframed into a narrative of external danger. Pat Brown and others point out that admitting the door was left open actually undermines the window story. Why would an abductor risk climbing in when a door was available? This contradiction lies at the heart of many debates. The unlocked door could represent the real vulnerability or another inconsistency in a tale rewritten under stress. At around 9:15 p.m., Jane Tanner claimed she saw a man striding across the road with a small child in his arms. She described the girl's pajamas as pale and the man's clothing as dark. This figure quickly became known as Tannerman and dominated the early investigation. Artists produced sketches. The McCanns' official website promoted the image. For years, appeals for information centered on this sighting. Yet serious problems emerged. At the very moment Tanner reported seeing Tannerman, Jerry McCann was outside speaking to another vacationer, Jez Wilkins, only a few yards away. Wilkins insisted he saw Tanner walk past but noticed nothing unusual. He saw no man, no child, no dramatic abduction. How could two adults in the same place observe such different realities? Critics suggested that Tanner may have misinterpreted what she saw in the dim light, or worse, that her account was tailored to support the abduction narrative. Years later, the Metropolitan Police on their Crime Watch program proposed that Tannerman was in fact a man named Dr. Totman, an innocent holidaymaker carrying his daughter home from the Croatia. This re-identification should have rendered the sighting irrelevant, but by then it had already become a cornerstone of the case. The substitution of Totman for Tannerman felt, to skeptics, like a desperate attempt to protect the abduction framework rather than to resolve contradictions. Far more compelling to many analysts is what became known as the Smithman sighting. Around 9:55 to 10 p.m., the Smith family from Ireland encountered a man carrying a small girl in his arms as they walked back from dinner. The girl appeared about 3 or 4 years old, with light-colored pajamas. The sighting occurred near the road to the beach, within the critical time window of Madeleine's disappearance. Unlike Tanner's fleeting glance, this was a closer observation by multiple witnesses. Months later, family patriarch Martin Smith reported that when he later saw Jerry McCann on television carrying his son, he was struck by the similarity in gait and posture to the man he had seen in Praia da Luz. He never claimed absolute certainty, but the recognition was strong enough to raise eyebrows. The handling of this sighting reveals as much as the sighting itself. The McCanns consistently downplayed or ignored it, focusing instead on Tanner's account. Their official website rarely mentioned Smithman, and media appeals almost never highlighted it. To Pat Brown and others, this avoidance was telling. If the McCanns were innocent, Smithman should have been their top lead. Why did they distance themselves from it? The most logical answer, skeptics argue, is that the sighting was dangerously close to implicating someone they knew. Perhaps the most dramatic and contested clue came months later, when British cadaver dogs were brought into the investigation. These highly trained dogs alerted in multiple locations, behind the sofa in the McCann's apartment, on Kate McCann's clothing, on Madeleine's toy cuddle cat, and in the boot of the Renault Scenic the family rented weeks after the disappearance. To police and to the public, the implication was chilling. These dogs were signaling the scent of death. Forensic tests on samples collected revealed degraded DNA that showed partial matches to Madeleine. Yet the results were inconclusive. the Portuguese prosecutor declared that the evidence could not meet the threshold for prosecution. Supporters of the McCanns argued that cadaver dogs sometimes produce false positives, that DNA in small samples can be contaminated, and that the car had been used by many people. Critics countered that the pattern of alerts was too consistent to dismiss. Dogs do not lie, they argued, and the coincidence of so many signals in locations linked to the McCanns could not be explained away. The cadaver dog evidence sits at the intersection of science and interpretation. While not definitive in court, it adds a weight of suspicion in the public imagination. Combined with the other inconsistencies, it paints a picture that many believe points away from abduction and toward a death inside the apartment. Taken together, these 5 clues illustrate why the Madeleine McCann case has become one of the world's most famous mysteries. Each clue contains layers of contradiction. The window and shutter could be proof of intrusion or proof of staging. The unlocked door could be an open invitation to a predator, or a careless detail retrofitted into the story. Tannerman could be the abductor or a phantom conjured from dim light and faulty memory. Smithman could be the missing key, or an inconvenient witness sidelined for political reasons. The cadaver dogs could be reliable indicators of death or fallible animals whose alerts were overinterpreted. The absence of certainty in any of these clues has kept the case suspended in ambiguity. Investigators, journalists, and armchair detectives alike are drawn back to them, parsing language, rewatching interviews, debating forensic science, and mapping timelines. The McCann case endures because these 5 clues resist closure. They remain open to interpretation, each side claiming them as evidence of guilt or innocence. What is undeniable is that these clues, in their contradictions, propelled the disappearance of a 3-year-old girl into an international obsession. They transformed a local tragedy into a global mystery, one where every open window, every misremembered timeline, and every dog's bark is scrutinized as if it might hold the key. And yet, 17 years later, they have delivered no resolution, only a haunting reminder of how elusive truth can be when filtered through fear, media, and human fallibility. If there is one voice that has consistently challenged the abduction narrative, it is profiler Pat Brown. In her audiobook profile of the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, Brown lays out her case with clarity and precision. She does not hedge her words. For her, the evidence, both forensic and behavioral, points in one direction. Madeleine died inside apartment 5A on the evening of May 3, between 8:30 and 10 p.m. Her conclusion rests on a series of forensic markers that have long hovered on the edge of controversy. The most striking came from 2 highly trained dogs brought in months after Madeleine vanished. One was a cadaver dog, trained to detect the scent of human decomposition. The other was a blood detection dog, trained to signal the presence of even microscopic traces of blood. When they were released into the McCanns' holiday apartment, both reacted in multiple locations. The cadaver dog barked and froze behind the sofa in the living room. It signaled again on the pink toy cuddle cat, which Kate McCann had often been photographed clutching in her grief. It alerted on Kate's clothing, specifically the trousers she was known to have worn in the days after Madeleine's disappearance. And most damningly, the dog signaled in the boot of the Renault Scenic, the car the McCanns rented more than 3 weeks after their daughter was reported missing. The blood detection dog reinforced these alerts, identifying traces behind the sofa and in the car. Samples collected from these areas were analyzed. Although degraded and incomplete, one DNA profile was consistent with Madeleine's genetic markers. It was not a full profile, and prosecutors ultimately deemed it insufficient for court. But for Brown, the combination of canine alerts and partial DNA was overwhelming. Dogs can make errors, she acknowledged, but their accuracy rates are high, and when both dogs converge on the same spots, the probability of coincidence drops sharply. These signals were not scattered randomly across Praia da Luz. They were concentrated in places intimately connected to the McCanns, their holiday flat, Kate's clothing, Madeleine's beloved toy, and the boot of the car the family themselves used. For Brown, this pattern told a coherent story. Madeleine died inside apartment Fuffy A. Her body was near the sofa long enough to leave cadaver traces. At some point, she was transported in the Scenic, where the dogs alerted again. The toy and clothing carried secondary transfer from contact with the body or contaminated surfaces. Brown contrasted these findings with the state of the supposed point of entry, the children's bedroom window. Kate insisted the window had been forced open, the curtain fluttering when she discovered her daughter gone. Yet forensic examination revealed no evidence of tampering. The sill carried no dirt or scuff consistent with a climb. The shutter, investigators concluded, was almost impossible to raise from the outside without noise. The only fingerprints belonged to Kate herself, left when she opened the window after finding Madeleine missing. To Brown, the implication was obvious. The open window was not evidence of intrusion, but a stage tableau designed to tell a story of abduction. If Madeleine had truly been abducted, Brown argued, there should have been some indication of an outsider's presence: fibers, footprints, DNA, disturbed surfaces. Instead, all the most telling traces pointed inward, toward the family's own environment. The evidence did not support the image of a shadowy predator slipping silently through the window. It supported the image of a crisis inside the apartment, hastily concealed. Brown also stressed the behavioral timeline. Who was the last person to verifiably see Madeleine alive? Not the CRA workers on the afternoon of May 3. Those records have been questioned. Not Jane Tanner, whose fleeting glimpse of Tannerman has been widely doubted. The last person, by Brown's account, was Jerry McCann himself during his 9:05 check. After that moment, no independent witness could confirm Madeleine's presence. From 9:05 until Kate's discovery at 10, Madeleine's fate lay in the shadows of uncertainty. Brown situated her death in this very window. She envisioned a scenario in which Madeleine suffered an accident, perhaps a fall from the sofa or bed, or a sudden medical episode. Jerry discovered her around 9:05, triggering panic. In those frantic minutes, he made a choice that Brown described as a sudden impulse to remove her body and conceal what had happened. This, she argued, explained the Smith family's sighting of a man carrying a child toward the beach around 9:55. It explained why cadaver scent lingered behind the sofa. It explained why later traces appeared in the family's car. And it explained why the open window and shifting alibis emerged, a desperate attempt to retrofit a narrative of abduction over the raw fact of a death in the flat. To Brown, every major contradiction in the case strengthens this conclusion. The window was open though no one entered. The door was left unlocked though the window was emphasized. The timelines of checks conflicted. Jane Tanner's account collided with Jez Wilkins' silence. The McCanns promoted Tannerman relentlessly while ignoring Smithman, the sighting that aligned with the possibility of concealment. Such patterns, Brown argued, are the hallmark of staging details selected, reshaped, and repeated to construct a version of events that never happened. In her audiobook, Brown returns repeatedly to the forensic trail. She emphasizes that cadaver dogs do not alert to theory or speculation, they alert to the chemical compounds of decomposition. Behind the sofa, on the toy, in the car the dogs barked. DNA, however partial, offered further corroboration. The absence of intrusion evidence at the window sealed the picture. For her, these were not vague impressions but hard indicators that Madeleine died in 5A. She framed her conclusion with the discipline of profiling. In moments of crisis, she explained, people do not orchestrate elaborate plays. They act quickly, grasping for survival. The simplest solution for Jerry, upon finding his daughter dead, was to hide her body. Later, in calmer hours, the abduction narrative crystallized, complete with window drama and alibi structures. But the raw evidence of the dogs and the DNA continued to whisper what really happened. Brown's profile does not claim to answer every question. Where Madeleine's body rests remains uncertain. How much the Tapas friends knew is debatable. Whether Kate was informed immediately or later is unresolved. Yet her central thesis is firm: the child did not vanish into the night at the hands of a stranger. She died inside the very apartment where her family had tucked her into bed. The cover-up, however elaborate, could not erase the traces left behind. The time frame, in Brown's analysis, narrows to less than 2 hours, sometime between 8 and 30, when the children were settled, and 10, when Kate raised the alarm. Madeleine's life ended. The dogs, the DNA, the unmarked window, the shifting stories all align with that window of death. and at its center, the last confirmed observer of Madeleine alive, her father. 17 years on, Brown's profile remains controversial, sometimes dismissed by those loyal to the abduction theory, sometimes embraced by skeptics of the official narrative. But whether one accepts her conclusion or not, her argument forces a hard confrontation with the evidence. The abduction story requires us to ignore the dogs, to dismiss the DNA, to believe in a silent intruder who left no trace. Brown's story requires us to accept the simplest explanation, that Madeleine died where she slept, and that everything after was an attempt to rewrite the truth. No element of the Madeleine McCann case is more shrouded in speculation than the question of what happened to her body. If one accepts the premise, argued by Pat Brown and many skeptics, that Madeleine died inside apartment 50A, the next inevitable question follows: where did she go? How could a body vanish in a busy resort town, leaving only faint forensic whispers and a trail of contradictions? Competing theories attempt to answer this, none more controversial than those advanced by Bernd Stellender in The Sudden Impulse, and none more grounded in behavioral profiling than those offered by Pat Brown. Stellender begins his theory with the night of May 2, which he insists was the true date of Madeleine's death. According to him, Jerry and Kate, perhaps with help from their friends, carried her body out of apartment 5A under the cover of darkness and into the cemetery at Praia da Luz. The town's cemetery is small, quiet, and only a short walk from the Ocean Club complex. In Stellander's account, this became the site of a desperate concealment. He imagines the McCanns or their associates prying open one of the above-ground tombs, sliding Madeleine's body inside alongside a deceased stranger, and sealing it again before dawn. This, in his telling, was the sudden impulse that gave his book its title, a reckless but immediate choice to hide the body in a sacred place. Driven by fear of discovery, the following day, May 3, the group allegedly staged the illusion that Madeleine was still alive, playing out a drama of creche drop-offs, casual dinner checks, and feigned normality until Kate's alarm that night set the abduction narrative in motion. Stellender does not stop at the cemetery. He argues that after securing a rental car weeks later, the McCanns moved Madeleine again. This time, he claims, they carried her to a hillside outside Praia da Luz, a slope frequented by joggers and overlooked by residents. There, Stellender reports, he found subtle but telling signs and M traced into the ground, heart-shaped patterns, pink flowers placed unnaturally, and disturbances he interpreted as the manipulated nature of hands. For him, these were not random markings of weather or coincidence. They were symbols of memorialization left by a grieving mother. To bolster his theory, Stellender claims to have spent 5 years surveilling this hillside. He describes setting up hidden cameras in hopes of capturing the McCanns returning to the grave. In his narrative, the effort bore fruit. He insists he recorded figures in the area, including 2 unidentified individuals he dubbed the Nuggets. These men, Stellender suggests, were sent by the McCanns to monitor the supposed grave sites after he had begun making his suspicions public. But Stellender has never released clear, verifiable footage of these alleged visits. For critics, this omission is fatal. Extraordinary claims demand extraordinary evidence, and in the absence of hard video proof, his accounts remain stories rather than substantiated findings. To Pat Brown, the talk of symbols, nuggets, and covert surveillance is not investigation, but speculation, built more on interpretation than on data. Brown rejects the cemetery scenario outright. From her perspective as a profiler, hiding a body in a public cemetery, prying open a tomb, and depending on secrecy in a small town is reckless in the extreme. It involves unnecessary risks and too many potential witnesses. She argues that Stellender's hillside memorial is equally improbable. Placing a body in an area so close to the family's jogging path and their known routines would be irrational. For Brown, Stellender's fixation on symbolic markings is a textbook case of confirmation bias, seeing what one expects to see and interpreting random patterns as deliberate signals. Her alternative begins with a much more practical step. If Jerry did act impulsively after discovering Madeleine dead, the nearest hiding place was the beach. Praia da Luz is only a short walk downhill from the apartment complex. Along the shoreline and its adjacent cliffs are overturned boats, rocky crevices, and sand-covered alcoves, places where a body could be temporarily hidden within minutes. This aligns with the Smith family's sighting of a man carrying a child toward the sea around 9:55 p.m. Brown suggests that Jerry may have deposited Madeleine's body there to buy time, expecting police to search for a living child, not a corpse. From the beach, Brown traces a second stage. Later that night, when the initial chaos had subsided and Kate had raised the alarm, the McCanns returned to the shoreline. At this point, they could have shifted the body to the Rocha Negra cliffs, a dramatic outcrop of dark volcanic rock overlooking the sea. The cliffs contain narrow gullies and slab-like rock formations. Brown and investigator Peter McLeod visited the site years later and noted how easily one could tuck a small body into a crevice, cover it with stones, and leave it hidden from casual searchers. The third stage in Brown's theory involves the family's rental car, the Renault Scenic, obtained weeks after Madeleine's disappearance. Cadaver dogs later alerted strongly to the boot of this car, and partial DNA consistent with Madeleine's was recovered there. To Brown, this is near conclusive evidence that the body was transported in the vehicle. The key question is where. Her answer points to Monte Dujo's Mester, a remote area north of Boudins, a short drive from Praia da Luz. This desolate terrain, government-owned and sparsely trafficked, is covered in scrub and brush, providing seclusion for anyone seeking to bury a body. Crucially, phone records show Jerry's mobile pinging in this vicinity after the Scenic was rented. For Brown, the convergence of phone data, geography, and cadaver dog alerts forms a compelling chain. By relocating Madeleine far outside town, the McCanns would have reduced the risk of accidental discovery. A grave close to the resort would invite suspicion if ever found. But in the barren outskirts, a body could lie undisturbed for decades. Forensic recovery becomes nearly impossible after years of decomposition in the Portuguese climate. From a psychological standpoint, Brown argues, this choice makes sense. People hiding evidence often want it far removed from the place of crisis. Out of sight becomes out of mind. Brown's emphasis on distance stems from her broader understanding of offender behavior. In the immediate aftermath of panic, concealment is often impulsive and close at hand. But once individuals have time to reflect and plan, they typically seek greater separation. The Praia da Luz cemetery and hillside fail this test. Both are too near, too risky, too accessible. In any unsolved case, investigators often look not only at forensic evidence, but also at how those closest to the victim behave after the event. Actions taken in the hours, days, and months following a tragedy can reveal as much as the crime scene itself. In the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, the post-crime behavior of her parents and their friends has been subject to relentless scrutiny. To some, their actions show the desperation of a family fighting for answers. To others, including profiler Pat Brown, the choices fit a different pattern altogether, what she calls the classic behavior of a cover-up. One of the most striking moments came when Kate McCann was formally declared an arguido, a Portuguese term for official suspect. With that designation came the right, and the expectation, to answer investigators' questions. Yet when faced with an extensive list of queries about the night of May 3, Kate refused to respond. She exercised her right to silence, answering only a few questions before declining the rest. To her defenders, this was understandable. She was protecting herself from a hostile investigation, one they believed had already decided she was guilty. To critics, her silence was damning. An innocent mother desperate to find her child, they argued, would answer anything and everything to aid the search. To Pat Brown, Kate's refusal exemplified the psychology of containment. The less said, the fewer contradictions to untangle later. Equally telling was the refusal of the Tapas 7 to participate in a police reconstruction of the events of May 3. Reenactments are a standard investigative tool designed to clarify timelines, identify inconsistencies, and test witness reliability. Yet, when Portuguese authorities called for a reconstruction, the friends declined. Some cited logistical difficulties, others pointed to mistrust of the investigation. But the refusal meant that investigators never had the chance to observe the group retracing their movements in real time. Brown regarded this as another red flag. If the abduction story were genuine, a reconstruction could only have strengthened their accounts. Declining it suggested that the group feared their stories would not withstand close scrutiny when played out on the actual terrain. While cooperation with investigators faltered, the McCanns were quick to engage the media. Within days of Madeleine's disappearance, they had established contact with the British press, giving interviews, releasing photographs, and shaping a narrative of abduction. Less than 3 weeks later, they traveled to Rome for a meeting with Pope Benedict's VI. Photographs of Kate and Jerry holding hands with the pontiff were splashed across front pages worldwide. The visit portrayed them as devout, grieving parents seeking spiritual comfort at the highest level of the Catholic Church. For many observers, however, the optics were jarring. Why would parents of a missing child embark on an international tour so soon after the disappearance? Why expend energy on symbolic gestures rather than remaining in Portugal to aid the search? Defenders saw it as a way to mobilize global awareness. Critics, including Brown, saw it as a carefully crafted image campaign designed to enshrine the abduction narrative and to place the McCanns in the role of victims, not suspects. In the months that followed, Jerry McCann maintained a blog on the family's official website. Instead of focusing solely on the search for Madeleine, he occasionally veered into political commentary and reflections on social issues. He also resumed jogging, often photographed running along the Portuguese coastline. For some, these were the actions of a man trying to cope with stress, clinging to routines, and maintaining physical and mental health. For others, the optics were unsettling. A father with a missing child, they argued, should not have time for politics or fitness. Brown interpreted this as part of the broader pattern. Public-facing behaviors were selected for their symbolic power, showing normalcy, projecting resilience, and keeping control of the narrative. But beneath that, she argued, lay the hallmark of post-crime management. Rather than raw grief, the McCanns projected curated images designed to reinforce the abduction story and shield themselves from deeper suspicion. Soon after Madeleine's disappearance, the family established the Find Madeleine Fund. Millions of pounds were raised through donations, charity events, and public appeals. The fund paid for private investigators, media campaigns, and legal support. Yet questions of transparency dogged it from the start. Critics asked whether money was being used more for reputation management and litigation than for the actual search. Legal bills mounted as the McCanns pursued defamation claims against newspapers and critics, including former police officer Gon Allo Amaral. Brown considered this another indicator of defensive behavior. While no parent could be faulted for seeking resources to find a child, the fund's operations, she argued, tilted more toward brand protection than evidence gathering. To her, this was the infrastructure of a cover-up masquerading as a search. Pat Brown's use of the term post-crime behavior comes from profiling tradition. When crimes occur, investigators study not just what happened, but how suspects act afterward. Cover-ups typically involve silence, refusal to reenact, diversion into symbolic acts, and attempts to control public perception. By contrast, genuine victims often display chaotic grief, erratic cooperation, and an overriding focus on the missing loved one. Through this lens, Kate's refusal to answer questions, the Tapas Group's avoidance of reconstruction, the strategic media appearances, Jerry's blog and jogs, and the management of the fund all pointed, in Brown's analysis, not to desperation, but to containment. She argued that these behaviors reflected a conscious or subconscious need to control the story, to keep investigators and the public locked into the abduction narrative, and to minimize opportunities for contradictions to surface. The British media played a crucial role in amplifying the McCanns' message. Headlines emphasized abduction, predators, and international threats. Rarely did coverage foreground inconsistencies, forensic evidence, or skeptical voices. When the Metropolitan Police launched their Crime Watch reconstruction years later, they devoted significant airtime to debunking the Tanner sighting, but gave little space to the Smith sighting. The result was a narrative skewed heavily toward the idea of an outside abductor, even as other evidence suggested otherwise. For Brown, this was no accident. Media management was part of the McCanns' post-crime strategy, consciously or not. By shaping the conversation early, they ensured that public sympathy would remain on their side, and that alternative theories would be branded as cruel or conspiratorial. Once sympathy is secured, Brown explained, it becomes a protective shield. The abduction image becomes not just a possibility, but an article of faith, making it harder for investigators or journalists to question without backlash. The question remains, were these behaviors those of grieving parents making mistakes under unimaginable pressure, or were they deliberate acts of concealment? To supporters of the McCanns, everything they did can be understood as desperation. The silence was legal self-preservation, the refusal of reconstruction or rejection of hostile police, the media campaigns a way to keep Madeleine's face in the public eye, the fund a necessary tool, the jogging and blogging coping mechanisms. To critics, the cumulative weight suggests something else entirely, a strategy, conscious or otherwise, to maintain control of a narrative that hid more than it revealed. Brown falls firmly in the latter camp. To her, these are not random choices, but consistent with the behavioral patterns of people who know more than they admit. In her profile, the McCanns' post-crime behavior does not cry out with the chaos of innocent desperation. It whispers with the careful caution of a cover-up. 17 years after Madeleine McCann vanished from apartment 5A in Praia da Luz, the case remains as unresolved as the night it began. Competing theories still circle one another. Bernd Stellander argues that May 2 was the true date of death, a revelation he believes would collapse the official timeline and eliminate Christian Bruckner as a suspect. Pat Brown counters that shifting the calendar changes nothing. Without a body or a confession, she insists, no legal system will ever deliver justice. Operation Grange, the Metropolitan Police Review launched in 2011, locked itself into the abduction hypothesis. By publicly framing the case this way, it not only narrowed investigative avenues, but also reinforced the McCanns' position as victims in the eyes of the media. That narrative still dominates British coverage, while alternative scenarios remain sidelined or dismissed as conspiratorial. The forensic record has offered tantalizing hints but no smoking gun. DNA samples were partial and degraded. The cadaver dog alerts, though compelling to many experts, fall short of courtroom standards. Every potential lead collapses under the weight of uncertainty, leaving investigators with nothing conclusive enough to bring charges. Here Stellander and Brown unexpectedly converge. Both acknowledge that only two developments could truly break the stalemate: a deathbed confession from someone with direct knowledge, or the discovery of Madeleine's remains with incontrovertible forensic ties. Until then, the case drifts in limbo, sustained less by evidence than by speculation and debate. And yet, the absence of closure ensures its survival in the public imagination. Each anniversary, each documentary, each new theory keeps the mystery alive. Madeleine's story may never yield final answers, but the persistence of inquiry guarantees she will never be forgotten.